Welcome back to Neuroconversant Leadership, where we talk about effective communication, especially in the leadership role. Have you ever struggled to get on the same page with all of your team? Have you ever realized only too late that you were never on the same page all along? It can be quite a challenge, so that's what we're going to talk about today. With us today, we have a very special guest, Rob Leone. Rob, welcome.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to be with you.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation, in part because we're not exactly sure what we're going to talk about. We had a little hiccup, so we'll see where this goes. It'll be good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your company, Black River,
Sure.
and how it started and why you started it?
Okay. Well, we'll back it up just a little bit more. I'm actually a professor at Idaho State University. I teach graduate and undergraduate students in the areas that relate to the psychology of work, motivation, decision making, improving organizational performance, individual performance, training, development, things like that. And so I've been doing that at this university for 13 years, and then I was at different universities before that doing different things related to that. So for as long as I can remember, consulting has kind of found its way into my life in terms of helping people. And, I think a lot of us have this desire to train others as a contribution, right? We see a lot of people in the workplace that want to, move out of their role into more of a training role because it's kind of service to humans, service to others. And so what I eventually realized was that there was definitely a need for the way I see the world and how I practice leadership and development. And so my wife Angie and I created Black River, 7 years ago now. So we started to do that, and our central tenet or focus is that work should fuel the human spirit and not drain it. And
Mm-hmm.
so we spend a lot of time in the area of culture development, and then how that parlays into leadership development as one of the strategies, as well as organizational performance. We really see the kind of the subtleties in the language that people talk about in the workplace in terms of leadership. Like they talk about motivation, empowerment, job satisfaction, autonomy, things like that. And those, they're definitely organizationally sexy terms, right? We talk about those things quite a bit, but we all have different definitions for many of those things. And I think where we differentiate some is that we're the first to tell you that any of those frameworks or approaches can be definitely positive, but any positive can become an overextension. And there's context to all of this, and that's really important. So one of the examples I often use is autonomy. And people come in and say, we need to give more autonomy to our people. We need more autonomous individuals. Therefore, they will be more engaged and enjoy their job more. But that's not necessarily accurate or true. That's a statement, and there's research that supports autonomy within a certain context. But the reality is that autonomy could also be a term of a form of benign neglect, and people perish and languish in positions because they have too much autonomy when they don't have the foundational elements to navigate that space, right? So we,
Yep.
we approach all these things with organizations in terms of having an eye on what makes them special, what makes them unique, what's their aspiration, what's their mission or calling or identity they aspire to be, and then how do we build those systems to reflect that.
I love it, and I love a lot of it. So I've got questions from a couple minutes ago, if
Perfect.
that's all right.
Go for
when
it.
when you were talking about those topics with
Yeah.
people in university, it seems like it's early. Like
Uh-huh.
it's not something that they need right then. It seems like
Oh yeah.
something that people need more once they're actually in the workplace. Am I misreading that?
Wow. You're not, and there's even context to that, right? Like you have the level of readiness to hear things, to put pieces together, right? So one of the neat things about my students that I really appreciate is that they're mid-career in many instances, and they're looking to move into more of a leadership role.
Hmm.
And so all of our courses are project based, based on whether it's things in their life and their organization, or based on my clients or people in the community I interact with. So when we have a conversation about, say, autonomy or engagement, it's someone that's probably has 5 to 10 years of real legitimate work experience under the belt. So the timing of that's really well. But right to your point, I agree that we have a problem at times, and sometimes we teach too much from the textbook and too much of the theory and the framework. Um, and I'm not saying that theory and framework shouldn't guide our practice. That's what we build all of our models off of. But it has to be presented in a way that people understand that this is not scripture. This is not exactly how it is all the time. That
Hmm.
there's variations, there's human aspects of this, and when we're working with humans, as we know, we have emotions, we have all these different cognitions, we have all these different factors that are flexing at any moment of the day. So right to your point, timing's important for these things, and you know, time in the position, time in the role is important so that people understand what these concepts are against what application is. But the other side, I also want to be very clear. I'm not someone that's coming in and saying, look, everything that happens in the workplace is different and it doesn't relate to the research or the scholarship. Like I live in a really special place where I have a foot in both, and they both inform each other. And that's actually what we've done is if you end up on our webpage, on our models page, you see a series of models that have been created based off of the scholarship and the research that informs it, but presented in a way that when we train and develop employees, it's something that's super easy for them to turn to make it a part of their vocabulary, and a part of their practice. Because our ambition is essentially to work ourselves out of a job, right? Our ambition is that we give people these tools and these frameworks, and then they can start peer coaching each other. So Jeremy, you
Hmm.
and I are working together, and if our organization was successful with us, we would get to a point where you'd come to me and say, "Hey, Rob, I don't know what to do about Fred. I'm really frustrated. I'm really, trying to figure out how I could support him better." And then my belief, my hope is that I start to turn to some of our tools. Let's talk about some of our assessments we've done. What's his personality type? What's his behavioral style? What's his communication style? Or let's talk about some of our other frameworks, whether it's the peak performance model or the CAR model for motivation or succession planning or engagement framework. And we start to teach each other and coach each other so that we start to develop that vocabulary and it becomes a part of the fabric of our organization and a part of our friendship and connection and things like that.
That is fantastic. I know when I am coaching, there was one time when I was coaching 30 different people in the same program, one on
Wow.
one. So I was
Wow.
having theoretically the same conversation 30 times in 1 week. Even though it was the exact same content that they were reading, they were
Yeah.
30 very different conversations because everyone's at a different point and they get a different thing out of it. And to your point, one of my favorite things is then I started doing group coaching, and
Yeah.
I love when I get to stop talking because they're all talking to each other and sharing their experiences. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. And that's what we aspire for organizations, right? So if we sequence culture and team development properly and we kind of renorm certain things that need to be renormed and create psychological safety and support so people feel like they can lean in, then just to your point there, the leader could step back, right? And the people take care of each other. They answer each other's questions. They hold each other accountable. The leaders actually only leveraged when they really need it. It was interesting. I was doing a workshop not too long ago, and I was talking about goals. And I had a leader say, "Rob, I don't even, I can't even think about setting goals because I can barely see beyond the next couple days in terms of where my role is." And my response is that this is why we're doing this. We're working towards this point where hopefully you build that camaraderie, that trust around those people, like you were mentioning in this group coaching. They start to they start to challenge each other in a respectful way. They bring each other up. They give each other feedback, kudos when they need it, right? And so then eventually, it's kind of like you as the coach. You're like, man, this is a fun. and getting really easy because they're doing a lot of the work and they're gleaning the wisdom off the group. And I'm just kind of the conductor here, right? And so it's a great place to be. Exactly, steering
Just
them.
steering it a little bit.
Yeah,
One thing that I will tell managers all the time is that their job is to obsolete themselves, much like you were saying. And they're
perfect.
like, but then I don't have a job. I'm like, then you can get promoted.
Yeah, yeah,
Or if you don't get promoted, you then get to focus on the things you really, really want to, and you get to kind of define your own role.
yeah, exactly. I've often talked to people about the role of that supervisor, that leader, is to create the environment for their people to excel, to flourish. And right to your point there, right? And it's a great place to be. And then and this is where leaders really then can start to become more strategic, purposeful, right? You have to have time to unpack, right? What's going on in your head and what's going on in the environment. And this is one of the fatal flaws that I see with our busyness, or this talk that we talk about of how busy we are, is that we don't take pause frequently enough to reflect on things, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I'm excited for spending this whole week with this team next week, is that we're slowing things down, we're reflecting, we're going to be aspirational in certain aspects, we're going to have some fun, we're going to, get some laughs, but they're going to be at this point where they can do their best work because they're there and there's nothing else they can do except for what we're there to do.
And slowing down allows you to kind of go off the topic, which is when a lot of the best ideas happen. I know for me, when I was in corporate America, a bunch of us would go for a run or a bike ride at lunchtime. That's when all my best ideas happened. And there was a study done, an idea generation study. And if someone worked on coming up with the most uses of a piece of paper, then on average, in whatever it was, 4 minutes, they would get up to like 5. And if they stopped, did something similar, then came back, they'd get to 7. But if they stopped, did something totally different that absolutely changed the way their mind worked, and then came back, they would come up with over 9.
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of step away and have the
Yeah.
freedom to do that and then come back really can help generate so many great ideas.
Yeah. And so then we just blow that out into a much larger scale, right? So I remember starting to work with a client once and they're like, well, we could give you 45 minutes. I said, well, I'm not doing it if that's all we're getting. Can't do much in 45 minutes. And it's also that headspace you're talking about that's occurring. Like we're not giving people permission to take pause if we're squeezing something in. Now, if this is a staff meeting and we're going to kick in 45 minutes of development time as a team, sure, it's beautiful. It's perfect. We need to be doing that. But when this is an initiative, you need that space so that I think about it in terms of going on vacation. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but you have to, it takes me 3 days to really like we'll leave the country or we'll go somewhere and those first 3 days I'm still stuck in my head. It's not till the end of that third day, fourth day that I'm really settling in that my body starts to begin to appreciate that healing time, right? Of that. And if that takes 3 days for me just to be on vacation, what's happening with our people in terms of what we're doing with them, right? We've even taken this concept and every workshop we're trying to do now is not going to start before 9 a.m. just because we want them to, if they have to put out things that their reports are dealing with, that they have time to get that off their plate, move it on, remind them that they're gone so that they can have that space to go ahead and do some great things.
I've gone on 2-week vacations, and 2-week vacations are about 5 times as good as a 1-week vacation.
Absolutely.
Because to your point, it takes 2 or 3, 4 days to wind down. And then the last day or two, you're already thinking about going back. When it's a 2-week vacation, get a solid 7 or 8 days of just being on vacation. It's fantastic.
And you start to build this little bit of a habit too, right? Like you're like, oh, well, I don't need to think today. I'm still on vacation. Up until the point where I'm sure you're starting to prospect ahead and think about what's coming up this next week when you're getting on the plane or something. But at the same time, I've done that same thing too. And I just feel like, man, I like how I feel right now. I like my energy, and I'm going to enjoy this and ride this out as long as I can. If that means it's right up until I get back home and have to put on my winter coat because there was a snowstorm at home. You know what I mean? Walking to the car after getting off the plane.
Hopefully, no snowstorms for a little while for us, anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Spent the last month in snow.
making a hard subject change.
Yeah,
It's you and your wife founded the company together,
yeah,
and it's interesting. A lot of people struggle working with their spouse, but
yeah,
both of you are basically people who help others get along better and communicate well. So I'm curious
yeah.
how the journey for you has been working with your spouse.
So if we did not have the skills we have, we would not be together. Let's start there. We are do-overs. We call it do-overs. We talk about it frequently in workshops, or we'll share the stage. And we're two very different personality types. She's warm, chatty, outgoing. I'm a little bit slower, reserved, introverted, and so our styles don't mesh. In fact, they're quite a conflict to each other. And we often speak about this, how in our previous marriages that was very clear in our marriages that there were those conflicts in terms of personality and behavioral styles, but we didn't have the education, we didn't have the tools, we didn't have the framework to begin to have these conversations, or as well as our ego wasn't mature enough to recognize that this is just the other person trying to do their best, right? So it's a real special place where we're at right now, that we are so different. We tackle problems differently. And this doesn't mean that we don't, get on each other's nerves at times. I know I get on her nerves frequently. One of my overextensions is being critical and nitpicky, but it's also one of my strengths too in terms of analytical, right? And so what we've done is we've recognized that we each have something that we bring to this relationship as well as this business, and we divide and conquer, and we're at a spot where we know that if we need to step back or take a break or do something, right? We understand that we can't fill each other's cup wholly. She needs her girlfriends. I need my guys to do some things that help, rejuvenate us so that we could come together. So it's been a real wonderful experience working with her. We travel together almost 100% of the time when she has client work or I have client work. We're traveling together for
Nice.
that. Most of the time, actually, probably over 90% of the time, we are working with that same client in different ways.
Mm,
And so she might do a Monday session and Wednesday session. I'm doing Tuesday and a half a day Wednesday with a different group. So, we're doing this while we're traveling. And so I have a friend that says, "You sure spend a lot of time together." And it's awesome because it's actually she's my best friend, and we have so much in common that it just works out well for us.
nice. I read a study about people who start dating, and it's the differences that are very, very attractive for about a year to a year and a half. And then after a year and a half, the differences start to get really annoying. And
Yeah.
that's when you have to figure out how to navigate the differences.
Well, and it's tough when you don't have the skills to navigate that space, right? But it's something different to say that you have the skills to create boundaries, or you have the skills to have those difficult conversations, right? So, I had the pleasure of talking with a couple guys out of Canada, and that's where I'm from actually, on a different podcast about conversations or experiences that we messed up. And one of the things I shared with him, as I'm going to share with you, is that I was raised in a family where confrontation did not exist. And so I never developed skills to do that. So, right to your point, that when people start having those conflicts in those relationships, we don't have the skills to work through that. What do we do? And we see in some instances not being able to remediate or resolve those differences, and whether it means it's a tough break or you stay together when you shouldn't stay together, perhaps, right? So it's it's one thing to realize those things. It's another thing to have the skills to be able to work through that. And I know for me, that was a big challenge for me to overcome.
One thing I talk about on this podcast very often is the willingness to stop and ask questions. And in personal relationships, it's incredibly valuable. If someone says something that really just gets your goat, if you have the wherewithal to stop and say, did you mean what I interpreted? Very often the answer is no. And going back to the earlier conversation where you're talking about our people need more autonomy, a it's can be such a buzzword, but a great question is why? Like,
Yeah.
what is the problem that you think autonomy is going to solve? And then really dig down into it. And it may not be necessarily autonomy, it may be a part of it, but there may be a much bigger picture going on if you can just stop and ask the question and really find out why. Why do you
Yeah.
think that's what you need?
Yeah. Be curious, right? Because you and I, just right out of the gate, we're going to have a different definition as well as scope of reference for what autonomy means to us at a gut level, right? Like we can
Hmm.
find the book and find the definition, but you take that and you multiply that by, say, we have 20 people on our team, and then it just gets complicated and complicated, right? And if we don't have a common language to discuss these things, to approach these things, and we're not asking questions, right? Like, was that your intention? Did you mean that? This is what I heard? Am I hearing this accurately? Right? We proceed down these paths that make it may in some instances very difficult to rebound and to pull back, right?
And that's one of the benefits that assessments can bring,
Yeah.
personality type assessments, is that it starts to give people working together a common language,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to conflict or making sure that you understand each other. Having a common language just goes so far.
Yeah, yeah, and it is. It's that starting point. That so when we work with organizations, we try to be very good stewards of their resources, right? So we believe in what they're doing with us is an investment, and we try to position it as an investment, not an expense. And so if there's an instance where they're well down the path in some sort of vocabulary or language, if they're using the MBTI or DISC or one of these other many tools out there, predictive index, whatever they are, we try to honor that as best as we can because they're already starting down that path. And then how do we
Hmm.
integrate and build in that? But for a lot of groups, um, that experience is kind of like Swiss cheese, lots of holes in it. Like there's been some work, some people have done some things, some people have done something else. So we have to start with something like that because it does, to your point, give them a foundation, gives them a framework, gives them a starting point. And not all of these assessments are the same, right? Like some will push out a couple page report. Some will push out a couple page report that requires someone with a psychology degree to interpret, and then
Hmm.
some will push out really lengthy reports, right? And so it's important to kind of shop around because some of them will give you a little bit more perspective and tools in terms of how do we get to know each other? What makes Jeremy tick versus me? And where am I likely maybe going to overstep, right? Or because if you think about it, we communicate with others in in accordance with how we want them to communicate with us. And so if you just assume that there's four different styles or eight different styles or whatever that is, that means you're leaving everyone else out there and you're trying to connect with someone in a similar manner. And so that's great insight to learn that, oh, look, this is where I am. So we use Angie and I as an example. I'm much more passive. I'm slower paced. I'm not that emotional. And actually, I kind of, when she talks about emotions, it's like, oh, emotions, like, let's talk about the facts, right? This is what happened. It's not as important how you feel. Here's the facts, right? And I've learned that that's all part of who she is. And that's what I have to understand and accept and embrace as I have conversations so that she truly hears what I have to say and vice versa.
One issue that I have in my house, we're also do-overs, is that everyone talks much faster
Uh-huh.
with no pause. And I abhor interrupting someone because I don't want to be interrupted.
Uh-huh.
And if I don't interrupt them, I never get a chance to speak.
Yeah.
Literally none. So I will either force myself to kind of interrupt, like when they're just about done, then I'll start talking. But sometimes I misjudge it, or I just raise my hand so that they know that I want to say something next.
Make it really obvious to them, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
can I have the time now? Yeah.
But for me,
It's
it's an issue often because most people speak much faster with very few
yeah.
pauses compared to the way I speak.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you in many of those instances. There's areas that we're trained up and we've learned, right? Like I wouldn't be a good salesman for my company or as an instructor if I just kind of resigned my fate to my typography, my profile of introversion, right, and withdrawn and slow. So I have to develop skills to do these things in different environments, and that's helped me be more successful. But yeah, you're definitely right.
Knowing's half the battle. Just because
Absolutely.
my tendencies to be one way doesn't mean I have to be that way.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, Rob, we
Yeah,
need to start wrapping up. But before I
absolutely.
ask you my three questions, can you
Uh-huh.
share with everybody how they can best learn more about you and/or reach out?
Sure. So on LinkedIn, you could look me up just in the search box, type Rob, R-O-B. My last name, as you mentioned, is Leon, but it's actually spelled Lion, L-I-O-N. So R-O-B-L-I-O-N. Search. You should be able to find me on LinkedIn. If you want to check out our website, I mentioned that we have models, we have podcasts, we have blogs, we have different contributions based all around what we talked about here. That's Black River, then the letter P for performance, and the letter M for management.com. So blackriverpm.com. And there's actually contact information if people actually want to have a conversation. We are always open for calls and just hear where people are coming from to see whether or not we might be a good fit. And so people could reach out anytime.
Perfect. I will put notes to that in the show notes so that they can just find you that much easier.
Thank you.
So, as we wrap up, the
Yeah.
first question, we talked a little bit about travel.
Yeah.
What's a place you've been and loved, and what's a place you've not yet been but want to go?
I've been very fortunate. This last year, I've been away from the university, and that I've been on a sabbatical. And culture is an aspect of part of my research for the sabbatical in terms of job fit. So what we did was we traveled several different countries, and I just we spent 3 weeks in Thailand and then bounced over to Singapore, as well as we were in Mexico several times and Ireland and Belize and places. But I just I loved being in Thailand.
Nice. And where would you like to go that you haven't been yet?
We actually we have a person on our team that's from the Philippines, and I would love to see where her family comes from and learn more about her and her family. And so the Philippines is right out there. We're actually in this next year trying to grow out us an Eastern, Southeastern Asia type of marketplace because we have clients in Africa now and some different countries, as well as north of the border, south of the border here. So it's a space where we love to be in that region, and so we look forward to doing that.
It's a lot of travel opportunities. Good
It
for you.
is.
The question number two is who is a person who you think is a great communicator?
I think Angie's a great communicator, my wife, and and knowing her story because she does a lot of talks about her development and her life. Uh, and we joke about this at times, is that I don't think she would have been a great communicator, the young version of her.
Mhm.
Just like how I said, I don't know if we would have made it without these tools and these experiences. But she's a teacher that has taken the lessons and applied them to herself, and she lives by them. And she's a great partner to have because she is a great communicator. She just runs a lot faster than I do, and that just wears me out.
I like the lesson that you just shared that it's a learnable skill.
Yes.
Some people are naturally tend to be better at it, but it doesn't mean that someone who doesn't think they're a good communicator can't become a good communicator. So thank you for adding that.
Absolutely. Well,
And then,
if I could, can I just mention this real quick on that comment?
yeah.
This is my worry is that people that are naturally, I air quotes on the podcast, right, that are naturally better at it, it doesn't necessarily mean though they're connecting with people of all sorts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we work with salespeople at time, or we don't work with them at time because they think they have it, and what they're doing is they're selling to a certain portion of the population, and what they don't realize is that they're missing sales, missing opportunities because they can't they might be charismatic and good in a certain area, but they're not good for everyone. And not that we have to be good for everyone, but it's to that point that definitely learned and there's a lot of different people and different interests that we can better understand how to connect with.
Quick story is I was giving a presentation about communication to engineers. And then there was a realtor in the room, and the realtor asked if I could do this for realtors as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking to the board of realtors about communication, and I asked them all, I said, you talk to people all day long. Do you think you're a good communicator? And everyone raised their hand. They're like, absolutely, we are very good communicators. I said, you know who else are really good communicators? Engineers. And you could hear a pin drop. I'm like, they're just good in a very different way than you are.
Yeah.
But between
Yeah.
them, they're great at communication, and you're great at communication. It doesn't mean you don't need to work on it because everyone's so different.
It takes a special realtor to sell to an engineer, right?
Yes.
Because of the difference.
Yep. And then the last question is,
Yeah.
what is one piece of communication advice we can all benefit from?
Be curious, be a learner, be a student, right? Like student of life, student of all this stuff, right? It's, I appreciate the opportunity to sit here and share with you and visit with you, but to some extent, we're drinking the same Kool-Aid, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we subscribe to a certain level of belief in all this stuff. And so continue to be curious, continue to learn, sharing a part of this and, get to know people that are different. And it's a to me, it's the travel this year was so powerful because I was able to see how people live and love differently, and just to continue to recognize that I need to be there and serve a whole variety of people, not just a certain type of people.
Yeah. Being curious makes life an adventure.
Yeah.
Rob, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks, Jeremy. This is awesome.
Thank you so much for listening to Neuroconversant Leadership. If you found this beneficial, can you do me one small favor? It'll be quick, I promise. Can you go and give this podcast a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen before doing anything else? Unless you're driving. If you're driving, then I need you to keep driving. And then when you're done and parked, then go ahead and give me a review. Hopefully 5 stars, but whatever you are comfortable honestly giving. Thank you and have a great day.